Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Shirley Hoekstra. Doesn't a nation have a duty to regulate its borders? And yet, on the other hand, should undocumented people live and work in constant fear of being arrested? They have U.S. children who are born here, and they then suffer the ill effects of bad immigration policy. Today's guest is going to help us sort through what seems like an unsolvable problem. So join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Jenny Yang, Vice President for Advocacy and Policy at World Relief, which serves vulnerable people groups through dozens of offices around the world. She is co-author of the book, Welcoming the Stranger, Justice, Compassion, and Truth in the Immigration Debate. Welcome, Jenny.
Great, thanks so much for having me, Shirley. It's good to be here.
Isn't it true that nations do have an obligation to regulate their borders and their populations?
Definitely. I think all countries have a sovereignty and a right to regulate who comes in and who comes out of their country. And I think with the issue of immigration, a lot of times it's tested the sovereignty of nations to a certain degree, but immigration is really a worldwide phenomenon. It affects almost every country around the world, and a lot of it over the past 2 to 3 decades has really been because the poverty income or the poverty rates between countries have been actually growing starker. And so you see this worldwide phenomenon of people who are constantly on the move. And oftentimes what happens is if a country's immigration laws are not keeping up with the demands of the economy or the needs of people to want to migrate, then oftentimes what you have is the challenge of immigration within any given context. And I think in the United States of America, our immigration laws actually haven't changed in about 40 years significantly. And so you do have this challenge where, how do you regulate the borders in a way that allows people to go freely back and forth within existing immigration laws, but how do you reform them in a way that really reflects the current needs of our economy and the real desire for people to even be together with their families?
And I think that there's such a value of the rule of law in the United States. And when you have, I think the number is 11 to 12 million undocumented persons in the country, it seems to flaunt this rule of law.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's true. I think the challenge has constantly been with the issue of immigration, that you do have immigration laws on the books. And I think the rule of law is very important, and I think good laws are important as well. And so I think the larger question we have to ask ourselves is, are the laws good? And are they actually functioning for the common good? And I think when you actually look at our immigration laws, oftentimes the tension with immigration is not necessarily high-skilled workers or engineers who are coming in, because the immigrant pool that are coming into the United States is really diverse. But I think the controversy specifically is around low-skilled workers, especially maybe predominantly those coming from Central or South America, and that's where a lot of the tension lies. So I think first it's important to acknowledge that the immigrant pool is a diverse pool that we're talking about. But I do think that when you actually look at our immigration laws, the lines that people have to get into, to come into the United States, is either really restricted or actually not moving at all. And so there's 2 ways that immigrants can come into the United States. First, you can find a job here and have an employer sponsor you to come here, or you need to have a family member to come into the United States. If you don't have one or the other,
who's come legally.
Right. So for the family-based system right now, the lines are actually, it depends what category you're in. If you're the spouse of a lawful permanent resident, the wait can be 2 to 3 years, which for some is really long. For others, you can wait a couple of years to be reunited with your spouses. If you're actually from the Philippines and you apply for your brother and sister as a U.S. citizen, the wait can actually be up to 18 years currently. So the waiting times are really, really long. And so for an employment-based, that's for the family-based system. For the employment-based system, it's actually geared towards very high-skilled workers, or you have to have over $1 million to invest in the U.S. economy. And there's only about 5,000 visas available for low-skilled immigrants to come into the United States every year.
So how did the laws get so restrictive? You said they haven't changed in 40 years.
Sure.
And we all have visions and stories of people who came over on a boat and went through Ellis Island, and they came with some ease. At least that's what the narrative is. So what happened so that we were afraid of this coming of so many people and we got restrictive?
Sure. Well, I think if you look at the history of immigration to the United States, there's always been this resistance to new immigrants coming in. And, you know, in the founding of our country, the English were mostly Protestant, and they feared German immigrants coming in because they couldn't speak English and they looked different than the English. The Germans came, they were integrated, then it was the Irish. And for the Irish, it was, oh, they're Catholic. So we're a mostly Protestant country, and if we have Catholics coming, that's going to create a huge problem for us. And then you have resistance against and discrimination against the Italians and others, even the Dutch that were coming in huge numbers as well. And you have successive waves of immigrants coming from different areas of the world. And at every time, it wasn't easy for any of them, but they eventually integrated and became Americans in the full sense of what an American is. And so now you have the challenge of immigrants who are actually mostly coming from Central and South America. And I think the challenge is not to view them as people who are not integrating, because they are in large numbers, but a lot of them through the second and third generation are learning English even more quickly than their parents did. They're actually integrating in terms of just being able to go to our schools and really picking themselves up by the bootstraps, and their parents are working in higher numbers than even others did before them. And so the rate of integration that we see with immigrants is really high, I think, for the current immigrant population. But I think, you know, over the years, if you look at the history of immigration to the United States, it's always been this challenge, and I think it always happens when you have new groups of people who are coming in at any one time.
So there's this misconception that immigrants are bad for the economy, and yet your book talks so much about the fact that our economy would actually have a negative impact if all of the immigrants left.
Well, if you take a look at a lot of research that economists have done over the past several years, and even before that, they make an assessment of what impact immigrants are having, and especially actually looking at undocumented immigrants. And there was a survey by the Wall Street Journal, which is, you know, a conservative publication, several years ago, and they surveyed 46 economists, and 44 out of the 46 said it's not just immigrants that are good for our economy, it's actually undocumented immigrants that are benefiting our economy as well. And when you look at economists, the reason pretty much on the whole why they say immigrants are good for the U.S. economy is that they're always looking at the flow of labor and goods across borders, and immigrants often respond to the labor needs of an economy and really fill holes and gaps in our economy where a lot of Americans won't do these kinds of jobs.
I'm not sure that people always believe that. I think they think that undocumented workers are taking jobs away from native U.S. people.
I think in certain areas that could be true, and I think in areas where there is a high unemployment rate, maybe that could be true. But if you look at the trend, even of education in the United States, you know, we're not growing our kids oftentimes to go into agricultural labor, or we're becoming highly more educated. I think we're having a higher graduation rate from high school. But you still have sectors of the economy where you need low-skilled labor in terms of people who just work for 8 to 10 hours a day picking fruit in the fields, and that kind of work can't be mechanized. And so even when you talk to farmers or people even in the construction industry, where it's estimated that 30% of the construction workers are undocumented immigrants, they say, I can, you know, make the pay rate $20, $30 an hour, or even higher than that, and Americans come and do the job, but oftentimes, even if I pay them a lot more, they won't stay because it's just really, really difficult work. And so the people that will come and actually do the work are immigrants, and they do some of the best work they've ever seen. Some of them are actually farmers from where they're coming from. They have this incredible work ethic where they don't complain, and they're just grateful for the opportunity to work in this country. And so you have this immigrants do fill holes in the economy, and I think what makes it challenging, though, and that has made the playing field unlevel, though, is the fact that a lot of them are here without documentation.
Right, and this also causes a legal problem. So again, because we think the rule of law is so important here and people should have rights under that law, when you're undocumented, there is this exploitation issue that they can actually be harmed, and it can cause their families and themselves to not have a very pleasant kind of work environment here. What do we do about that?
Most employers, I think, want to do the right thing and appreciate the fact that they do have really great immigrant workers working in these kinds of jobs. But for some bad apples, they they enjoy the fact that they're here undocumented because they can underpay them, they can exploit them. And in fact, what a lot of us may not realize is that a broken immigration system is a trafficker's best friend, because they take advantage of the fact that there's someone here without documentation, they're foreign born, they don't speak English well. And some of the worst cases of trafficking right here in the United States have actually been immigrants who are found chained to trailers in the middle of the field. They're not fed very well. They're completely not paid at all. And they work hours on end picking tomatoes, for example, and not getting paid at all for their work. And so you do see this issue of exploitation because they're here without documentation. And that's why I think that the issue of the need for reforming our immigration laws is so important, because not only do you reduce the tendency for employers to want to exploit immigrant workers, but you level the playing field for all workers, including American workers, so that there isn't this underpayment of immigrant workers and others that are really here just to find a job.
I think on the flip side, there's also a fear that undocumented folks are getting all this free ride, that they're coming in and they're getting benefits, they're getting education, they're getting health care, and they're not paying for it. And so that makes us feel like we're foolish as citizens. Like, why are we so dumb? Why can't we get this thing regulated?
Sure. Well, I think most immigrants actually, undocumented immigrants, don't qualify for any kind of federal benefits. So it's existent in U.S. law that if you're here without documentation or you're here illegally, you're not eligible for any federal benefits. Even if you're here legally, as a legal immigrant, you have to wait 5 years to be eligible for federal benefits. So even for legal immigrants, it's difficult for them to access federal benefits. What's actually really interesting that most people don't know is that undocumented immigrants, the Social Security Administration estimates that 75% of them actually pay Social Security. So the IRS doesn't care that you're here without documentation. As long as you're living in the United States, they want you to pay taxes.
So what happens is people get a false Social Security number.
Yes.
And then, of course, they have to pay their taxes. And then when it gets to Washington, they don't have an actual person that connects with that number.
Right.
But they've got the money.
They have the money. And in fact, the Social Security Administration says that it weren't for undocumented immigrants, it would become insolvent because it's literally about $12 billion last year.
$12 billion?
$12 billion that were paid in taxes that are unaccounted for, that are just going to the fund that undocumented immigrants will just never benefit from because they're here without documentation. So they file their taxes. They have a false Social Security number, but then they file their taxes using ITIN, which is the Individual Taxpayer Identification Number. And that's how they pay taxes on the money that they earn as well. But I think the question you asked just about the costs that immigrants have, it is true. I think in certain areas where there's a large number of immigrants, whether it's a border state like Texas or California, that there are costs to immigrants, especially when it comes to education and healthcare. In certain areas, there's a lot of immigrants in specific hospitals, and all undocumented kids up to grade 12 can get free access to education. But economists don't just do cost analysis, they do cost-benefit analysis. And the Cato Institute is a conservative think tank in Washington, D.C., and they've done analysis of the cost-benefit. And they've said that over a lifetime, an immigrant actually pays about $80,000 more in taxes than they take away in benefits.
So let's say that you have a person who came in as undocumented, and then they actually are a very good citizen, paying taxes, contributing to the economy, raising a family, and now they have U.S.-born children, and so we know that the children are actually citizens. How is it that we can do some comprehensive immigration reform in order to make sure that this family doesn't get split up and the fear is reduced for the parents who may be undocumented, and that the children can thrive more? What is it going to take us for us as a country to get some immigration reform?
What we've seen over many years, actually, with Republican and Democratic administrations is that there seems to be a commonality of understanding of what the right policy solution is. And basically, at World Relief, we boil it down into 3 points. The first being, we have to make it harder for immigrants to immigrate illegally. So we're for border security. We need some kind of mechanism for employers to verify the status of their workers. So we need enforcement at the border and inside the border as well, at the workplace. But then secondly, if we're going to make it harder for immigrants to immigrate illegally, we have to make it easier for them to immigrate legally. So why not reform the visa system through which immigrants can come? And like I mentioned earlier, it is really difficult for immigrants. There oftentimes is no line for them to get into, or the lines aren't moving.
Because at the embassies, they either have to prove that they're educated to a certain amount, a degree, or that they have a certain amount of cash or assets. And so there isn't even right now a way for them to get a visa, correct?
That's correct. You basically have to prove that you won't become a public liability for the U.S. public, and you have to basically prove that you're 125% above the poverty line. And so for low-skilled workers especially, they cannot meet those requirements, and so they're oftentimes ineligible to even qualify for a visa to come here.
But they then ultimately do come illegally, get jobs, and then are good citizens.
If you survey the undocumented population, about half actually did cross the border, but it's estimated that about 40% came legally on a visa but overstayed their visa. So we've spent billions of dollars on border security over the past couple of years, and so it's important, I think, to focus on both, not just border security, which is, needs to be secure, but we also need to focus on the legal avenues as well.
But how can a nation guarantee that there will be a job? Let's say you want to let in unskilled workers, and you think, yep, there should be jobs in restaurant work or in the hospitality work or in agriculture. How can we guarantee that once they're in, they'll actually seek a job?
Well, I think it depends on the visa category. So for right now, actually, if an immigrant applies for an employment-based visa, your status in the United States is directly tied to the employer. So if you leave the employer or if you change jobs, it's actually very difficult to keep that visa. So that's actually been a complaint that a lot of people have said is, well, it ties that immigrant to that job. There's no flexibility. But again, in order to qualify for that visa and to stay in a legal manner, you have to basically stay with that employer, and that has to be continued throughout the tenure of your visa. And so, that is an important question, and that's always been debated in Congress is, well, how do you determine the levels of immigration to the United States? And people have suggested, well, why don't we create a commission where, depending on the labor needs of the economy, the numbers of immigrants or visas available changes, so that it's not a static number, but it actually changes with the needs of the economy. And some people have said, well, that's a great idea. Businesses have said, well, I think we should have set numbers because I want a reliable workforce. So some people have had differing opinions about that, but that's just one way to really think about it being more of a flexible and responsive rather than just a static number. And over the past few years, especially as we've seen a downturn in the economy, the number of undocumented immigrants has actually declined. And so what you see with immigration is that they are really responding to the needs of the U.S. economy, and I think that level really changes depending on the economy.
So what about earned legalization? Okay, so this word amnesty has a lot of radioactivity to it because people don't want to reward illegal behavior. On the other hand, we have to find a way to take care of 11 to 12 million people who are here undocumented. So what are reasonable expectations to earn your legality in the country, you think?
Well, I think it's been polarizing, the immigration debate, because oftentimes people have said, well, let's just mass deport everybody, which on a humanitarian level and an economic fiscal level just doesn't make any sense, I don't think. But then you also have this idea of amnesty, which is let's just forgive and forget that any offense was committed, which doesn't really support the rule of law as well. So a middle-of-the-ground approach that we've advocated for is what we call an earned legalization, which basically means an opportunity for immigrants to admit the fact that they did commit an immigration offense, and there has to be a penalty associated with that. So whether it's a financial penalty or paying back taxes if they haven't paid them, getting to the back of the line, learning English, there's a bunch of requirements and steps that immigrants can take to earn the right to stay in this country. And it's only when you meet these requirements that you're able to earn the legal status and maybe eventual citizenship in this country. But it's important to understand, too, that with this 11 million undocumented immigrant population, a lot of them oftentimes don't want to stay here permanently, but the fact that they're here without documentation, it prevents them from actually going back home. So if they had some kind of legal status, they could actually travel back to their home countries, maybe even visit their families, and earn enough money to eventually go back to their home country. So the undocumented immigrant population, if we give them that flexibility where they can earn the right to stay here, it'll allow them to travel back and forth and create a circular migration of some sorts. But for many where they do have family and community here, a lot of them do want to integrate. And this is the last hurdle that they have to actually become full Americans in every sense of the word.
And your book is called Welcoming the Stranger. Mm-hmm. Why should people, moral people, people of faith, care about welcoming the stranger?
Most people of faith, actually, whether you're Catholic or Jewish or Unitarian or as a Christian, that if you read throughout Scripture, immigration is mentioned throughout the Bible, whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament. And the common theme that you hear throughout Scripture is that God cares for the immigrant, and he often mentions them with the widow and the orphan as people groups who are really vulnerable in a community. And so God repeatedly calls his followers to actually take care of the immigrant who are living among you, that you shouldn't exploit them, that you should take care of them, and this idea of hospitality, that you're supposed to welcome them and not see them as a threat, but actually see them as a blessing into your country, is something that faith communities across the board have received really well. And in fact, over the past several months and past couple of years, what we're seeing is this convergence of opinion from the faith community that are all saying we need reform of our immigration laws, and as a faith community, we need to do a better job of welcoming immigrants into our community. And in fact, most conservative evangelical leaders have actually said something positive. The Evangelical Immigration Table, and there's a website by the same name, evangelical.immigration.com, there's a list of about 140 evangelical leaders that have all spoken out. People that we probably never would have thought would have said something positive about immigration are all saying the same thing, which is these are people who are not strangers from us. They're actually one of us. We know them, they go to our churches, they're a part of our communities. And as a country, we would be doing so much better if we acknowledged them and actually did something to integrate them fully into our communities.
I know from personal experience that when I have met immigrant individuals, people who have had hardship, people have said, I'm going to rely on God for something bigger than myself, I see how deep their faith is. And this actually challenges my faith as an American who actually has so many things, so many comforts, so many things that come fairly easily. I think that the church would be continually blessed by integrating a more diverse population even into our own congregations.
Yeah, definitely. And what we're seeing as well is that there's been surveys done of faith communities, and what's disappointing, because I'm from the evangelical faith tradition, is that it's mostly white evangelicals that are the most threatened by immigrants who are coming into the United States. And so part of that is, there's a lot of misconceptions about who immigrants are and where they're coming from and what they contribute. But I think the bigger question, as you were saying, is a lot of them are people of great faith, and they are revitalizing churches in the United States. The Catholic Church, the Evangelical Church, there's been surveys done saying that if it weren't for immigrants coming into the United States, a lot of our churches and denominations would be dying off completely. And so immigrants are bringing this vibrant faith to the church in the United States, which cannot be ignored, I think. But also for many believers, it's a great opportunity to bring immigrants into our communities and make them feel welcome.
So sometimes we fear cultural diversity because it feels strange, and sometimes we can embrace cultural diversity because they add so much in the arts, in cuisine, in the way in which we see science, the beauty of other people's point of view. This actually enriches a community if we can get past the fear. It seems to me like you're saying, if we get to know each other.
Yeah, and the relationship, I think, is so key, because oftentimes what you'll find is that we base our understanding and treatment of another individual based on what we hear in the news or statistics or surveys or studies, and it's not based on what we actually know about that person. And so having a relationship with someone, getting to know your local worker or a person that is from another country, hearing their story of how they came here and how it affected them can really challenge our faith and also really help us stick to the values of what founded us as a country, which is we welcome everyone who comes to our shores, and everyone has something to contribute, and they're wanting to become Americans, and we can be a part of that process.
And as you have studied and worked with individuals on this project, what do you think still people need to understand most about this immigration issue?
I think first and foremost is the fact that immigration is not a new phenomenon. It's not like all immigrants from everywhere want to suddenly come to the United States of America. It's been with us since the founding of our country, and all of us have immigrant roots. And, we think our ancestors came, they pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and, they learned English and they did really, really well. But if you go back to all of our family histories, that was most oftentimes not the case, where they struggled and where they weren't welcomed by other people in their community who were there before them. And so it's really important to keep that perspective, I think, because what immigrants face today it's not a new thing. And I think we as Americans can do just so much of a better job of welcoming those who are different than us. And I think secondly as well is there are needs for policy changes, but I think there's also a need for us to really be more welcoming in our attitudes and in the rhetoric, because so much of the time we hear immigrants referred to as illegal aliens. It sounds like they're Martians or coming from another place, and we dehumanize immigrants, and it's part of the way that we talk, and I think the language we use is also equally as important. And also just understanding what are some of the base facts about how immigration laws work, how maybe they're not working right now, what improvements can be made. And as citizens living in a democracy, we all have a role to play in making sure our elected officials heed the messages and actually make policies and laws that are reflective of the common good.
Thank you. My guest today has been Jenny Yang, Vice President of Advocacy and Policy at World Relief and co-author of the book, Welcoming the Stranger, Justice, Compassion, and Truth in the Immigration Debate. I'm Shirley Hoekstra, and thank you for watching Inner Compass.